Hi friends, this is Miss Erin coming to you from the University City Public Library, and I am ready to read you a story. Are you ready to listen? I hope that you're someplace comfy where you can sit back, relax, and enjoy. The story I have to share with you today is about a little old man, a little old lady, and potatoes. And when you put those things together, you wouldn't expect a whole lot of story and a whole lot of excitement. But when you add a magic pot to the mix, you end up with more excitement than you would think and friends along the way. This is the story One Potato, Two Potato by Cynthia DeFelice, and the pictures are by Andrea Uren. Meet Mr. and Mrs. O'Grady. They lived alone on a bare and rocky hillside. Their children had grown up long ago and gone out into the wide world to seek their fortunes. But Mr. and Mrs. O'Grady stayed behind in their cottage, where they had little, but shared everything. Mr. and Mrs. O'Grady were so poor they dug one potato from their garden every day, and they called it breakfast, lunch, and supper. And they were considered lucky to have it. They were so skinny they could sit side by side on one chair to eat. And it was a good thing, too, because one chair was all they had. Mrs. O'Grady had only one hairpin. Together, they had but one blanket that was full of holes, one raggedy coat, which they took turns wearing in the winter. They had just one candle, which they never burned. Every evening as the sun went down and the darkness was nigh, Mrs. O'Grady would pretend to light the candle. And every morning when the sun rose and light filled their little house, she pretended to blow the candle out. They had one gold coin, which they were saving for a rainy day, and which they kept tucked under the straw of their mattress. Now, Mr. O'Grady was a fine husband to Mrs. Grady, and it's all that she could have wanted. Yet, it was the wish of her heart to have a friend, someone with whom she could share recipes for boiled potatoes, and sweet memories of how it felt to hug her newborn babies and touch their downy heads. To be sure, Mrs. O'Grady was the finest wife that Mr. O'Grady could imagine, and yet he too longed for a friend, someone with whom he could discuss the potato weevils and root rot. They just want to have a friend they can talk to. It's not a bad thing. One day, Mr. O'Grady was out digging in the field for their meal, as he did every day. To his dismay, he saw that he had come to the very last potato. In the very last row. Oh no. Hoping he had somehow missed one, he dug a little bit deeper. What was this? Well, it's harder than a potato, bigger than a potato, blacker than a potato. It was a pot. Mr. O'Grady was quite surprised that he'd never come across it before in their tiny garden, and he wanted to show the curious object to his wife. Since he needed both hands to carry it, he put the last potato in the pot and started for home. "Mrs. O'Grady, come quickly," he called. Mrs. O'Grady rushed to the door. "Well, what have you got there, husband?" "Well," said Mr. O'Grady, setting the pot on the floor, "it's a pot." "Well, aye, it is," said Mrs. O'Grady, "but it's much too big for cooking." "Well, so far it's come in handy to carry our last potato home." "Our last potato!" exclaimed Mrs. O'Grady. "Saints have mercy! Whatever will we do?" She leaned over the pot to reach for the potato. As she did, her hairpin fell out of her hair and into the pot. She paid it little mind, though, for inside the pot were 2 potatoes. She held them up. "Husband," she scolded, "you oughtn't joke about such things." Wait, he did only put one potato in the pot, right? She's got 2 potatoes. "But I wasn't joking," said Mr. O'Grady, befuddled by the sight of the second potato. "I only put 1 potato in the pot." Mrs. O'Grady smiled. "And only 1 hairpin fell into the pot. I suppose that now I'll find 2. She reached into the pot, and her face grew pale. When she withdrew her hands, they held not 1, but 2 hairpins. "Husband, how could this be?" she whispered. 1 goes in, 2 goes out. Mr. O'Grady took one of the hairpins and threw it in the pot. Quickly, he reached back in and pulled out 2 hairpins. "Now I have 3 hairpins instead of 1, Mrs. O'Grady said. Happily, she began arranging her hair. Mr. O'Grady said, "Wife, think! Surely this pot is magic. If it made another potato and 2 more hairpins, what do you think would happen if we put in," he looked around the room, "our candle?" Mrs. O'Grady ran to get the candle and tossed it in the pot. Sure enough, she pulled out 2 candles so exactly alike that one couldn't tell the old from the new. Next, Mr. O'Grady put their coat into the pot. Out came another coat as raggedy and torn as the first. Then in went the blanket, and out came 2 blankets with holes in the exact same place. Mrs. O'Grady hugged her husband. "We'll both be warm this winter," she said. They're so thankful. Now they don't have to share anymore. They each get a blanket, they each get a coat. Mr. O'Grady took the 2 potatoes, placed them in the pot, and pulled out 4. He placed 4 potatoes into the pot and took out 8. And when he put the 8 potatoes in, 16 potatoes were waiting to be pulled from the pot. Soon the O'Gradys had enough potatoes for a feast. Mrs. O'Grady made herself a whole set of new hairpins and enough candles to light their nights through the darkest winter. Well, they're figuring it out now. Mr. O'Grady tried to put the chair in the pot, but it didn't quite fit. "No matter," he said, "one chair has served us for a long time." But Mrs. O'Grady, who was a clever woman, had been thinking. She went over to the mattress and with trembling fingers took out their gold coin. "Husband," she said, "do you suppose the pot's magic might work on this?" Holding her breath, she tossed the gold coin into the pot. That 1 coin became 2, then 2 became 4, 4 became 8, 8 became 16, and soon the floor was covered with gold coins. Mr. O'Grady put several of the coins into his pocket. "Dear wife, I am going to the village to buy you a new coat, a new blanket, and a new chair." I don't think they've had anything new for a long, long time. Mrs. O'Grady waved goodbye to her husband. She put the potatoes in a sack. She gathered up the coins and placed them under the mattress. Then she went outside, where she found a single flower growing on the bare and rocky hillside. Soon she had a bouquet of flowers just like it. Tired out from all the excitement, Mrs. O'Grady wrapped herself in both blankets and took a nap. She was awakened by her husband's cheerful whistle as he came through the door, his arms filled with packages. Eager to see what he had bought, Mrs. O'Grady ran to meet him. She tripped and fell and landed head first in the pot. "Help me out of here, husband," she cried. Packages flew through the air as Mr. O'Grady raced over to the pot. There were his wife's skinny little legs sticking out of the top, kicking back and forth. Mr. O'Grady grabbed on tightly, pulled poor old Mrs. Grady out of the pot, and set her gently on the floor. But saints have mercy! Now there were 2 more skinny little legs kicking back and forth. Without thinking, Mr. O'Grady reached into the pot, grabbed those skinny little legs, and pulled out another Mrs. O'Grady, so exactly like his wife that he could scarcely tell the difference. "Oh dear, oh woe," Mr. O'Grady moaned. "One wife is all I ever wanted." When the first Mrs. O'Grady had recovered from her surprise, she smiled and said, "There's only one thing to be done." Mr. O'Grady pointed to the second Mrs. O'Grady. "Throw her back in?" "Not at all," said the first Mrs. O'Grady. "You, husband, must jump into the pot yourself." "Jump into the pot? But then there'll be 2 of me as well." "Quite so," said the first Mrs. O'Grady. "Then we will have a wife for each husband and a husband for each wife. And best of all," she pleaded happily, "you will have a friend at last, and so will I." Mr. O'Grady thought for a moment. He took a deep breath and jumped head first into the pot. His worn leather boots stuck out of the top. Together, the 2 Mrs. O'Gradys grabbed onto the boots and pulled out Mr. O'Grady. Sure enough, now there were 2 more boots sticking out of the top. Both Mrs. O'Gradys grabbed onto the boots and pulled out another Mr. O'Grady, so like the first that they could scarcely tell the difference. The O'Gradys, all 4 of them now, looked at one another. As they talked, they realized they had a great deal in common. Already they felt like the closest of friends. The first Mr. and Mrs. O'Grady agreed that the new Mr. and Mrs. O'Grady made a handsome couple indeed. Over a candlelight supper of 2 potatoes each, the Mrs. O'Gradys spoke happily of babies and booties, while the Mr. O'Gradys discussed potato weevils and root rot. Afterward, the first Mrs. O'Grady wrapped her arms around the pot and said, "Thank you." Then she said to the others, "Surely we have everything we could possibly want. Let's bury this wonderful pot for someone else to find." It's extremely generous of them. So they did. And from that day forward, all of the O'Gradys lived happily together. They were, like they liked to say, simply beside themselves with joy. I told you that a story about potatoes could still be fun. I'm glad the O'Gradys ended up happy, and I'm glad they decided that they wanted everything they want. So, I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope that you want to come visit in the library. We're open again on the inside. You can come in and you can browse and look for books like One Potato, Two Potato that you can take home and enjoy. I hope to see you soon. Bye.